Good morning, High Rock. I'm Walt, one of the High Rock pastors. I am glad to be with you today. I'm with Pastor Meghan, and this morning we're going to invite you into a conversation with the two of us as we continue to explore the deep water of the book of Jonah. We're calling the series Deep Water because while Jonah literally found himself in deep water, we, as a country and a culture, often find ourselves in over our heads. And it felt like the water got a little bit deeper this week with the news of the verdict in the case of Breonna Taylor's killing. Many of us yearn for justice to roll down like a river, and yet often it feels like we are caught up in a flood of injustice and pain. But we come together because we believe that God is with us in the flood, because Black lives are precious to God, and that God will bring us out to life, all of us, on the other side. However you are feeling today, we're so glad that you can be with us as we seek to learn from God's Word together.
So last week, Pastor Dave invited us to listen to what God might be inviting us into that could be hard. We saw that Jonah didn't want to do the hard thing that God was asking him to do because it meant he had to extend the grace God had given him to others, even the people he hated. I have to admit that for me, that's been a really hard challenge. I like to imagine that I really don't hate anyone, but sometimes it's really easy to be ambivalent towards people I don't agree with or who seem to be throwing hate my way. Like, if you were in Nineveh and I was Jonah, I wouldn't want to go engage with you. I would just be perfectly fine looking the other way. And I keep asking God what it looks like to actively love those folks while still keeping my integrity and convictions that come from my faith. Where did that land with you, Walt?
I'm with you. I've heard this story a ton, and it's always been so easy to roll my eyes and be like, Jonah, stop being so disobedient and go do what God called you to do. But Dave was so helpful last week in explaining why this wasn't just an easy task. The Ninevites were violent and terrible, but God loved them and wanted Jonah to go and tell them that. And it made me step back and think, who are the people I can't stand? Who do I have a tough time with? Who are the people that I think are toxic or vile or regressive? And when I was faced with the idea that God would call me to love them, I suddenly got Jonah's issues a bit more. The phrase that kept coming to my mind was, yeah, but they're terrible. Yeah, but they will never change. Yeah, but maybe I want them to get a little bit of judgment. And I was confronted with the fact that while I love the idea of helping people know the love of God, more often than not, the people I want to engage with are a lot like me, the right kind of people.
For sure. I mean, most of us like the spaces that are easier to navigate or relationships that are affirming. But as we've been in this text and you've been asking that question, I've realized that sometimes being affirmed means that I just get a lot of likes on a Facebook op-ed that's suggesting that other people might be wrong. That makes me righteous and another person or a group of people unrighteous or wrong even. I mean, if you talk to my husband Brad long enough, he'll tell you that I am never wrong, or at least when I'm not in a healthy place, I'm going to be slow to admit that I am.
Oh yeah, I definitely get the "you're never wrong, are you?" from Jen a lot, and it's not a compliment. And it's one thing to work this out in a marriage with a gracious spouse who's committed to helping us grow. They won't let us ignore the negative side effects of our insistence that we're right. But it's another thing when we're talking about groups of people. What happens when you set up your life in such a way that the only voices you hear are the ones that affirm you are right? You can never really be challenged, never really consider other perspectives, or never really learn how to empathize with or love someone else. Because what could these other groups of people have to offer you? My wife and my friends, well, they're usually able to break through my defenses because I trust them and I know that they're for me. But those who are outside, it's a lot harder to get through.
Do you think that it's because nowadays we're more entrenched than ever? I mean, it's probably easy to identify your own spheres, the people that agree with you, and then all the people that are wrong. I mean, it's a part of the reason that a lot of people quit Facebook during election seasons. I mean, within Christianity, we have our own bubbles too. Christians for Trump, Christians against Trumpism, Christians saying Black Lives Matter, Christians saying all lives matter, Christians eating at Chick-fil-A and Christians lying about not eating at Chick-fil-A. Christians on both sides of the aisles are getting further entrenched in their ideologies and righteousness. But from the outside, people who aren't Christians don't really care. It just makes all of us look wrong. I know that I've been at fault a lot of times in these places, but as I've grown in this area, I've tried to communicate in love. But, I lost friends when I've said that Black Lives Matter on Facebook. I asked one woman in particular what had happened, and she told me she only wanted to see pictures of my kids and that she didn't think Jesus could support what I was saying about racism. That stung. We've always had a good relationship, and then suddenly I was outside of that. But this is what was happening with Jonah, too. In our text today, we read that he was literally sleeping while there was a huge storm going on, threatening to capsize his boat, and he felt pretty secure in his own righteousness. He's running from God, feeling okay about it, and so it reads like he didn't even care that the whole thing was crumbling right around him. But the other guys on the boat, who I'm sure he thought were wrong about so much, were recognizing this storm for what it was, an actual threat to their lives. They were probably like, dude, what are you doing?
And this is what I think is so fascinating about this story. We have Jonah, who's supposed to be this archetype of Jewish righteousness, one of God's prophets. And then we have these pagan sailors. Meghan, I know you've never been told you have a mouth like a sailor. It's not a good thing. These guys have a reputation for being the opposite of righteous, which makes their contrast with Jonah even stronger. But here they are, all in this storm, this crisis together. If the boat goes down, they all go down. And look how different their postures are. Jonah is absorbed in his own problems, but the sailors are trying to save all their lives. Jonah is asleep while the sailors are frantically throwing everything and anything overboard to keep from drowning. The sailors cry out to their gods. They pray, but Jonah is silent. He hasn't said a word to God in this whole story so far. You think that if Jonah really got the heart of God, well, he'd lead the charge when it came to praying, when it came to caring for those around him. But in this moment, these non-Jewish sailors are demonstrating much more righteousness than he is, and he isn't even able to see it.
We could all point out the glaringly obvious ways that we run from God, or if you're still coming to terms with that, when we choose to hurt other people for our own gain. But Walt, I think that part of Jonah's issue here is that he doesn't even recognize that he has a common problem with these sailors. He was so stuck in his own national identity that he saw the sailors as other and honestly as wrong. And so he didn't feel the need to participate in bailing out the sinking ship.
Say a little bit more about that national identity piece.
So Pastor Dave talked last week about how Jonah hated the Ninevites and that he saw them as worthy of punishment. But part of that came from his own forgetfulness about who he was. Right? The Israelites were formed as a people that were meant to be a blessing to all people. Their relationship to God was supposed to be an example of God's character of love for all creation. And one of the earliest church fathers, Irenaeus, described the glory of God is all human beings made fully alive. But in part because of the hate and persecution that the Israelites experienced from other people, it became easier to create tightly knit communities of people who lived the same way, thought the same way, and had the same national identity. It also meant that the blessing for the whole world was reserved only for those that shared Jonah's national identity. He wasn't seeing with God's heart. He was stuck in the sin of nationalism.
Yes, and that's what's so ironic about this whole scene. It's the sailors who weren't part of Jonah's nation that bring God into the situation. They prompt him to confess that he worships the Lord. The sailors point the prophet back to God. And that feels weird. Like, that's not the way it's supposed to go. And it reminds me of a story from my own life. Many years ago, I had a friend who is very passionate about creation care and environmental justice, and who is definitely not a Christian. And we get to talking about big questions like the meaning of life and what we've been made for and yada, yada, yada. And she'd always come back to caring for the environment, and I'd roll my eyes because in my mind, that was not really a Christian thing. We should be concerned about our behavior and other people's souls, not climate change. So I would dismiss her concerns and change the topic. And then one day, she started emailing me all these articles written by Christians who were working on a theology of creation, who were calling Christians to look at what the Bible had to say about God's world and the command to be good stewards of it.
How did that make you feel?
At first, I was surprised. I was like, wait, what? I'm supposed to be the one who's sending you the Bible verses. And then honestly, I just felt embarrassed. If the only way she thought she could get my attention was by Googling around for articles on the environment from a Christian perspective, something's off. I wasn't listening to her, and maybe I was missing something more.
That's the worst, right? I mean, I feel like when I'm embarrassed, it comes out of this sense of having failed or that I'm wrong. It feels like I have to double down because our world is painting people as right or wrong, and I don't want to be the one that's wrong. Friends, we're going to take a short break to give you time to reflect on some of these themes at home or in the chat. Welcome back. So, Walt, after you were embarrassed with your friend, how did you choose to respond?
Well, at her prompting, I looked at the scriptures. I realized that some things I had thought about God and the world were incomplete. My understanding of things was too small. I thought that God was only concerned about the things I was concerned about. And at that point in my life, it was usually about my personal devotion, conduct, and maybe girls. And while God is concerned about those things, when I looked at the scriptures, I realized that God was concerned about way more than just that. God has compassion over all that God has made. I did not. In the same way, Jonah's concerns were a lot smaller and narrower than God's. Jonah was concerned about the conflict between Israel and Nineveh. Jonah was concerned that God would call him to Nineveh, even when a storm was raging around him. Jonah was preoccupied with himself and his own agenda. But God was concerned with so much more.
And Walt, I think that that's the primary function of this text. The author is inviting the reader to consider that we might be more like Jonah than we care to admit, and that God might be bigger than we can ever imagine. From the outset, Jonah's view of God's heart was too much like his own, and so he made God's heart far too small. It wasn't until he encountered these sailors and later on the people in Nineveh that he's reminded he needs a bigger vision. But like you were, I wonder if he was embarrassed that these men who weren't supposed to have anything to say about his faith were the ones that called him out.
You said something about how God's heart was bigger than what Jonah could imagine. What do you mean by that?
I think that at its core, I'm saying that Jonah had an idea of God that made the sailors outside of God's love. So he didn't really have to care about what happened to them. But remember, God's love is oriented towards the blessing of the world. And as Christians, we always talk about the gospel, the good news that God has always loved the world, the whole world. So nothing is outside of God's love. God's desire is for the flourishing of all people, not a particular subset. And often it's in diverse types of community that I'm reminded of that most fully. Because while God not only loves everyone, but God can speak through anyone. I just have to shift my posture to be ready to listen.
Absolutely. I love the church. I've been serving in Christian communities ever since I graduated from college, and I hope to for a long, long time. I love being around people who share my love of Jesus, who want to grow together, who want to challenge and encourage one another. I am so grateful for the church. And yet, because I've been in these spaces for so long, I know how easy it can be to make it my whole world. I'm only hearing from like-minded people and being challenged by like-minded people. And when that happens, I become closed off to other perspectives. I get condescending and judgmental towards those outside the church. I forget the scope of God's love. So I need to remember that the church is not the whole world. And this has meant taking active, intentional steps to engage in spaces and relationships that are different. Meghan, you and I talk a lot about how we love our gym communities. That's been one of the biggest losses for us of the pandemic. Missing that regular interaction with those people that I saw almost daily for years, and not to mention saying goodbye to all my lifting PRs. Preach. My friends at the gym, these neighbors that I know, these are the people who challenged me to reflect on the consistency of my faith and my life. I can't just hide in the bottom of the boat like Jonah. I'm out in the open. They see me every day. And that means I need to be open to learning from them and even being challenged by these friends.
So when you talk about these people challenging you toward a better way of following Jesus, it sort of breaks down the lines of who's right or wrong and who's able to hold you accountable to following Jesus, huh? I mean, this idea that a person can hold their faith privately without integration in public life isn't really true.
Right. If we believe that God loves the world and we follow God into loving the world, that means we have to open ourselves up to others evaluating the consistency of our faith. Specifically, does our faith truly serve the public good? Are we like Jonah in the boat, ignoring the crisis? Have we given into thinking that people not like us are other, so that we have a right to ignore their humanity, their needs, their concerns? As you said earlier, Meghan, our country seems to be doing this now more than ever, and Christians are willing participants. But if God speaks through sailors and through my friend who cared about the environment, then we need to be in dialogue and ready to listen wherever and through whomever God might speak. Too often we're like Jonah, in a storm with people that are not like us, but unwilling to engage with them because we don't like them, because they aren't a part of our people. They have the wrong politics. Or maybe we feel like they're the group with all the power, so why should we want to be Jesus to them? But of course, that was the situation with Jonah and Nineveh. Nineveh had the power, and he did not.
Right. And when Jonah does make his way to Nineveh, we'll see that he isn't just telling them that they're awesome. He's calling them to realize that the things they're doing are awful and that they should turn back to God's heart for life. Being Jesus to people doesn't mean that we don't engage them with truth, but it absolutely means that we engage them with love, because that's what we see Jesus doing. Jesus, who is a much more faithful prophet than Jonah was. Jesus came and spent time with people who trusted God and those who didn't. He spoke truth to people, but I noticed that Jesus asked more questions than he gave answers, even if he knew all the answers anyway. When he did that, it made people feel seen and known, and the way that he asked them those questions made them feel loved. When people feel seen, known, and loved, they're more likely to engage with questions, want to step further into a relationship, and think more about a response than just a knee-jerk reaction. But it all started because Jesus saw them as people loved by God and treated them that way. I personally love the story in the Gospel of John where Jesus approaches the Samaritan woman at the well, because it's the exact opposite of Jonah's story with the sailors on the boat. Here's a woman who was a different nationality, a different gender. She believed different things about God, and Jesus engaged her with a question. He saw her and he treated her like a human. After she had that invitation through a question, she sort of went at him like, you claim to be about all of this work of God, but what do you have to say about people like me? Do you even care about me? And Jesus goes on to ask her some pretty hard stuff, the sort of stuff that would normally embarrass her or make her shut down, but instead it just causes her to respond, and it changes her life so that she might flourish out of the love that God has for her. Jesus saw her as a person, and he accepted her questions as valid. He invited her into relationship, and then he challenged her to deeper self-reflection through questions. He didn't have to be right in order to be in relationship. He had to see her with God's eyes.
Meghan, I really wonder what it would look like if we all tried to enter into relationships more like Jesus and less like Jonah during this season. Maybe the current storm we're in gives us that opportunity to choose. Given the divisive nature of the world and the criticism of Christians, it would be easy just to stay with our people, the people just like us. But if we could shift our postures to see people through God's eyes and even be willing to hear their critiques they might offer about our faith, I wonder how God might end up being glorified in our seemingly compromised position. Because despite what we might often feel, our faith has never been about winning an argument or being right. It's about sacrificial love that leads to life. I know that as we've been talking about the scripture and the sermon, we've both been identifying people that we want to shift towards in order to be less like Jonah and more like Jesus. It's felt challenging. We both felt a lot of those yeah buts come to mind. But we believe that this is what it means to follow Jesus in this season. And High Rock family, we'd love for you to join us in this. We want you to consider who are the people around you that aren't like you. It could be the neighbor who has a bunch of signs in their yard for the other guy. It could be a family member or old friend that you see posting all kinds of nonsense on social media. It could be a colleague of a different faith tradition or different life experience. How could you step towards them in love, following the pattern that Jesus gave us, seeing them as made in the image of God and inviting honest conversation around difference? Would you be willing to become vulnerable, even open to critique, for the sake of your own spiritual growth and to demonstrate radical love to your neighbor?
Friends, thanks for coming with us this week in our conversation. And join us next week as we explore part 2 of this passage. We're going to consider what life might look like if we can make that step towards love like Jesus, and how it could actually invite people who aren't Christians into that love too.